I wanted to start out with something, though, that none of you found as fascinating as I did, which was just the idea of the human microbiome. And when we talk about health and humans, there's something that's really interesting about human beings is we in our world tend to think about humans as this self-contained body, and we think of ourselves as having these human cells, and we grow and develop. But the funny thing is there are actually more non-human cells in our body, growing in our body, on our body, all around us, than we have human cells. Now, some of those microorganisms are crucial for human life. In fact, we can't digest things without a bunch of bacteria that are growing in our gut and helping us with our digestion. And they're growing there independently. Of course, if we weren't there, they wouldn't be there. But also, if they weren't there, we wouldn't be there. So you may know now that people are talking about your gut biome and how to improve your gut microbiome and what you need to do and eating yogurt and stuff like that. But the thing is whenever we think about health, it is very interesting that in some ways, humans are a host for more creatures, more cells, and more microorganisms than we have our own human cells. So the people that think about health in a more holistic sense as being part of humans as part of the environment and not just trying to treat illness as the human body exclusively are probably in some ways scientifically correct. That is to say, we have always been this larger than life host for all of these other creatures. Now, I want to talk about the table that goes on for several pages, and I just thought it was interesting to dig into different parts of these, what happens in human history. Now, we can talk about evolutionary biology and how health has changed, but it's also important to realize that many of the diseases that we have and many of the things that afflict us and our health issues are part and parcel of our human culture and our social changes that we have made over time. So if we go back a long time to big game hunting, we see that if you start hunting wild animals, you're going to get diseases that get introduced there. And then we've talked about how with agriculture and permanent settlements and domesticated animals, it leads to all kinds of other new diseases breaking onto the scene. And around this table in your text, I wanted to also mention they talk about, speaking of things that live on and in and around human bodies, when we invent clothing and bedding and things to keep us warm, that also helps with parasitic insects. So we talked about why we know, a long time ago, we talked about why we know humans had invented clothing, and it was because we figured out there were body lice that had diverged and become a new species from head lice. So it creates new ways for these parasitic insects to get into our lives. We've talked about this a few times, but about the clearing of land and irrigation, basically human activity in terms of irrigating and the agricultural activities that were carried out in certain parts of the world, not all, but in certain parts of the world, leads to breeding ground for mosquitoes and then malaria. And we talked about then the presence of sickle cell trait, which is again an evolutionary response to disease, but a rather hard one to go through because it can also be very debilitating for people who are born or homozygous sickle cell. And with the use of agriculture and domesticated animals, we have the emergence of a number of different diseases. In the next part, something else happens with urbanization, getting more concentrated environments. What's happening here? What is this called when we start urbanizing and all these flu, measles, typhoid, smallpox? So many syllables, very nice. Yes, the first epidemiological transition. So this is a time in which a lot of these things that are still with us today emerge. Flu, measles, typhoid, smallpox, tuberculosis are still around, and they emerge during this time of urbanization. Something else that they talk about in the text around these tables. So disease teeth are if something went wrong with your teeth in an earlier time, it was hugely problematic. It could lead to not being able to eat. It can lead to sepsis and even death. And so, yes, in some ways, although some of these things are still around with us, we have made some great strides here. So, vaccination against measles, smallpox, and typhoid, especially, these were the huge childhood killers, or baby, the huge rates of infant mortality were due to these diseases. We talked about in the last class how it was probably expected if you were going to be a parent, you were going to lose a child or two to one of these diseases. So it's one of the great health miracles that we were able to vaccinate and basically get these diseases down to almost nothing, in some cases almost eliminate them. That's why I'm a little bit nervous when I look around at the news you may be watching about the people that are being appointed to the new cabinet and how much vaccine skepticism they have. It's like, well, wait a second. I don't want to have measles or typhoid or smallpox. That was probably a good idea to get rid of them, especially for the babies. They're not great to get as an older person, but they're especially not great as kids. And so these kinds of things, or talking about, we don't need fluoride anymore, who cares? It can be important that we don't want to necessarily step back. Now, I don't want to be just a complete booster of all these things. As we'll talk about, modern medicine does come with its own issues as well, but boy, oh boy, I don't want smallpox to come back. I'm really not into that. Smallpox is one of the hugest killers of indigenous Americans. We talked about how, because of domestic animals, many of these poxes and plagues emerged in Eurasia because of humans' close association with domesticated animals. In the Americas, they had urbanization in various places, but they did not have many big domesticated animals, and their infectious diseases were not as many. And so during the first couple hundred years of European colonization, the indigenous people that were indigenous to the Americas throughout North America and South America died at much higher rates of things like smallpox because they didn't have natural resistances to those. They also didn't have the cultural tradition of what you do when smallpox comes to your town. If you were in a medieval town in Europe and you started to know and you started to get wind that smallpox was coming across or a plague was coming across, what do you do in your town? Anybody know how you handle these kinds of plagues if you know how to deal with them? You draw up the bridges, you don't let anybody into your town. If anybody gets smallpox, you isolate from them, and then when they die, you burn their house down. It was pretty brutal, but you had to do what you had to do. The Native Americans had no idea about this, and so they took up their traditional practices. If somebody got sick, you tried to go over and help them and visit them and sit with them. So it was a harsh lesson to learn. Europeans had learned the hard way, and so they knew that that's what you had to do. The one disease that may have gone from Native America or indigenous, the Americas, into Europe, but there's some debate about that, is syphilis. So that seems to may have spread the other direction. But for the most part, it was a more brutal one-way transmission of disease. Industrialization, oh yay, lead poisoning, cancers. Again, I'm not trying to say I want to deindustrialize or go back, but there are things there are trade-offs for all the things that we make and do. Now, again, I'm not into smallpox coming back, But we probably got maybe a little too excited about antibiotics when they came out, and everybody was like, "Oh, I got something, got a bacteria thing. I can just pop these pills and it'll take care of it." Yeah, so generally viruses we can't treat with anything. That's why we need vaccines against them. But yes, bacteria, we treat them with antibiotics, but there was an overuse of antibiotics because, again, at a certain point, we thought science would cure everything. You just pop some pills and everything's going to be great. But if you don't do this the right way, and especially worldwide, if you overuse antibiotics as a society, those organisms would like to evolve to be immune to the antibiotics. And so it sets off an evolutionary arms race. And so people say we can't see evolution, but we actually do. We can witness evolution. It's just not in the way that we like to witness it, which is we see the evolution of these pathogens and these microorganisms that we're trying to prevent, and they're trying to evolve to not be prevented. So we see these things emerge. They talk about habitat destruction and human-induced climate change. A lot of the things that are emerging today have to do with forests being cleared, people moving into new areas, different animals that were perhaps wild at one point, then coming into further contact with human beings and consumption. So things like Ebola, for example, and of course, COVID-19, which was exacerbated by people being able to move in high-speed international travel, as we all know too well. There's some interesting stuff down here as well about how people, since there seems to be higher rates of depression, for example, in today's world, and this seems related to higher rates of economic inequality. Personally, I do get a little bit depressed. I remember when I asked you all if any of you was a billionaire and nobody was a billionaire, and then I asked if any of you had even known any billionaires and nobody had even met any billionaires, and then you didn't even say that you thought you would be a billionaire. And so I want to be able to make you into a billionaire. That's my goal here in teaching you. But it seems like it's not that the things that make you a billionaire are not what I'm able to give you in class. You can't just get straight A's and then the next thing you know, you're a billionaire. You have to be born into it or something like that. It is distressing that the top three richest people in this country own more than the bottom 50% of our whole country. It's weird, and we don't even know them, can't even meet them, can't even get to be a billionaire. Very depressed about this. But anyway, like I said, steps forward, steps back. Sure, you'll figure it out. Another chart that I thought was interesting in here that gives you an idea of the way these terms in popular culture are often all interchanged, but in anthropology, we try to distinguish between these terms. In similar ways to we talked about how we distinguish between biological sex, the sex characteristics, and then the social meanings. There's different ways in which anthropologists use these terms. So by disease, what we mean are those things that you can actually identify biologically and are out there in the world. And by illness, that's how people start to feel about these things if they have a disease. And that can be socially variable. So how you respond to a disease is that idea of what's going on and how you seek comfort and care, we refer to as illness. And then sickness is a little bit overlapping with illness, but it's more the social recognition of these ideas. So again, in most cases, we use these terms in our everyday life interchangeably, but there is a difference, or we can think of a difference between simply having a biological symptom or some bacteria that we can identify as in the medical profession, and how people might react to that and treat people in society. Now, human beings are rather unique among other animals It's not that other animals don't care for each other, but the way in which we cooperate to care for each other is pretty unique to human beings. That is to say, we get together, we think about things, we care for each other. So part of it has to do with how we live in groups, which we've talked about, and how we cooperate and how we make tools together and learn from each other and culture in general. We also have something called empathy. Now, you may have, sometimes this gets confused with the word sympathy. Sympathy means, though, that you feel bad for someone else who is suffering. So you can have sympathy for someone. Empathy means that you are not only relating to them, but you're putting yourself in their shoes. You're trying to see things from their perspective. And this is something that is, again, it's very unique to human beings, or we think it's unique. Some other animals don't talk, so we can't ask them about this, but it's the ability to not just feel bad for somebody, but to imagine what it would be like if you were that person and how they must feel. Now, some people are better at this than others. Some people believe that empathy is a dying ability in our society, but I'm going to believe that you can bring it back. We also have, as human beings, that we can recognize what a disease is, to diagnose it, and the ability to accumulate and transmit knowledge over generations about what's going on with this disease and what can be used to treat it. So this is something that humans have been doing for as long as we've been human, is trying to care for the sick. This is perhaps one of the nicer things about human beings that we do. Now, that doesn't mean we're always nice to each other. And certain illnesses and certain afflictions can result in people shunning others. The role of stigma. It talked about how we've been better about now diagnosing mental illness and considering mental illness to be something that should be taken seriously and treated. But there still can be a lot of stigma about mental illness, and people can be shunned and made fun of and excluded from society because of that. I think that especially in the past, for those of you who read your Bible, leprosy was another disease that people was extremely stigmatized, in part because people didn't know what it was and how it spread. And so there were so-called leper colonies where you'd place people who had this disease and subjected them to stigma. On the same page, they talk about, well, then what is health? On the one hand, health, of course, is not being sick. So you're not suffering, you're not experiencing stigma, you don't have disease. It's the absence of that. But it's very important to our health that there's this other aspect, which is getting your world and life in balance. So simply not being sick, you may know, doesn't necessarily make you healthy. You also have to be embedded in positive, feel good about yourself and about your relationships with others. So, one of the interesting things about human beings is that, again, we obviously experience pain, but we experience pain in particular ways. In the textbook, it talks about one of the more difficult episodes of life for childbearing women, which is the pain of childbirth. And I'll just say they don't call this labor for nothing. This is a very intense experience, part because we have such big-headed babies. I'm trying to get those big-headed babies out of a narrow birth canal. What happens here? What do they talk about here in terms of different people experiencing this? Yeah, so some people may have thought they were going into something, but it came as a surprise or a shock and was experienced as this terrible thing. What happened to the other people? How did they experience this? Yeah, so it's a really interesting study that was done for the people who were indigenous to Fiji. They expected this. And it wasn't that they didn't experience pain, but it was seen as, yeah, that's what we're going to go through because that's part of being this part of transitioning into motherhood. For others, there's a distinction between the indigenous Fijians and the Indo-Fijians, which we'll not get into, but there's like in our society, there's different groups living here. But for other women, the same pain was experienced as a shock, and so it was something that they found not good at all. And so this is one of the interesting points about human beings is that even a biological experience of pain, what it means, how people experience it is sometimes different in different societies and can be influenced by how our age, our social position, our gender. And so we actually, in some ways, culturally experience pain as well as physically and emotionally. Which leads us to how we express pain, idioms of distress. Larry, after a very distressing practice today, what do we use? What are idioms of distress? Okay, so an indirect way. You said we do this all the time. I was trying to think of an example of how I do this, but I don't know if I can. Think of anything? Oh, stress and stomach pain. Yes, exactly. That actually is something that we sometimes feel pain in our bodies, but we don't know how to express it, or we feel something and it comes out in various ways. And so you get expressing stomach pain. Yes. Okay. So yeah, this is a really interesting example where they said they used these idioms, these figures of speech to represent how they were feeling. And the people that had gone there as doctors or nurses are like, okay, Tylenol, or okay, yeah, heart medicine or stomach medicine, and giving out pills when really what they were talking about was social dislocation and stress and needed something different. So it is important for those of you who are going into the caring professions in the medical field that we just try to keep in mind when people are talking, what are they saying? Now, you don't want to necessarily assume that somebody who says they have a headache doesn't actually have a headache and withhold medication, but you might want to probe a little deeper into that if you're going to be involved in that.